Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Annihilation Scourge, Four Kids Walk Into a Bank, and the soon-to-be-released Hawkeye Freefall, and plenty of other books. It's Matthew Rosenberg. Thanks for coming on, Matthew.
Thanks for having me. You sound so professional when you do that intro. It's really impressive.
You know, it's kind of funny. It's like my voice actually takes a tonal change. So I started saying like a radio host intro because it's the only time that I'm going to sound like a professional for the entirety of my podcast. And it is kind of funny. I feel like I like sound good during that one part. It's when I have some semblance of control to my own show.
You sounded great. If I can say so, you sounded really great. I was really caught off guard. Not that you don't always sound great, but that was extra great.
Well, thank you. Well, so this is actually, you have a very rare thing. I try really hard to not have guests twice on the podcast in 1 year. You are breaking that rule, Matthew. When we last talked, it was mostly Uncanny X-Men related at Emerald City this year. And you knew Jonathan Hickman was coming, as did I. I wanted to start there before we get into Hawkeye Freefall because, I don't know, I always find like writing comics for Marvel or DC to be really interesting because a lot of times there's things going on behind the scenes that we don't really know. There's like all these transition points and everything. And so you were writing a comic you know was a bit of a transition point before relaunch without anyone else knowing that. How does that change things for you? Does that make writing the book a little different, or is it you're just trying to write the best story in that environment that you can?
Yeah, I mean it's certainly a weird. I mean, writing any sort of Marvel DC kind of thing is always interesting because at the end of your run, it's sort of expected that you're kind of putting the toys back where you found them, you know. And so there is a little bit of an idea of like you're not radically changing most aspects of a character, you know, you're fixing things, you're not breaking things irreparably. And this was a weird one because I knew what was coming after me, which isn't normally the case. Normally you're setting the stage for question mark, and that person who comes on after you is sort of following your lead. But in this case, like Jonathan had started working on House of X and Powers of 10 before me and Kelly and Ed started on Uncanny X-Men. And so Kelly Thompson and Ed Brisson, who co-wrote the first 10 issues of the Uncanny run with me. And so we had a weird thing where, it was a transitional period for sure. And that was sort of our marching orders, was to be, you know, they sort of told us like, this is the end of an era of X-Men. Jonathan is bringing in a new era, like kill it, bury it, and then he'll bring it out into the light, which is both really, really strange because you're driving. I don't, you know, it's hard to explain why it's so different, but it really is like you're trying to get somewhere that doesn't exist yet, but right. Like you know it's going to exist. And it's a weird feeling, but also the nature of what Jonathan was doing, which, like, you know, I obviously don't want to talk too much about his books. I don't want to spoil them. You should read them. House of X, Powers of 10 are brilliant, and all the Dawn of X books have been awesome. But the nature of what he's doing allowed us and me to sort of allowed us to have a sort of lot of liberty, a lot of freedom in being a little more crazy and reckless and destructive with the toys because he had sort of built in a sort of fix for that. So in that case, like, yeah, it definitely changed what the story would be. You know, I think if you just handed me Uncanny X-Men and were like, it's yours for 25 issues or whatever, I would have done something very different. But there were all these caveats of like, you know, take it to a dark place, like, and this is the end of this era of X-Men. All those ideas were sort of baked into it to sort of say goodbye to what we have and to signal that something new was coming with Jonathan. And, you know, I think it's a sort of fun, creatively, it's a fun challenge. And with what I was allowed to do, I know that a lot of, I think what we ended up doing was pretty shocking to a lot of X-Men fans. Sometimes to the, some loved it and some hated it because it was such a departure from like what is sort of acceptable in a superhero comic because of the sort of level of carnage that we could inflict.
Right.
And that was, it's interesting to get to do that because this is sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity of knowing that there's this sort of a trapdoor built into it. But it also was very funny to me because at a certain point, once Jonathan's books were announced, I still have characters who are dying in my books.
Right.
And they're appearing on solicits for covers. I remember someone like getting really upset with me when Havoc died in the last issue of my run and was like, I can't believe you killed Havoc. And I was like, he's on the cover of a book that comes out in 2 weeks, right? Like, he's okay. He's going to be fine. Like, he's dead now. And I appreciate that people were invested enough to actually care. And, the sort of worst thing that can happen to you as a writer is to do something and have people be like, oh, I didn't care one way or another. So I, even when people are sort of upset and sad, it's like, well, that's, better than the opposite. But it was definitely a weird situation to find myself in.
It kind of reminds me of, it's like the wrestling concept of kayfabe. It's like the fact that those solicits were out there while your comics were coming out, it was like breaking kayfabe. It was like, that this whole thing is not the way it actually appears and that something's going to change this dramatically. But I mean, going back to what you were saying before, it is to a certain degree. I mean, it's always the case. Like, you're always going to hand off, as you noted. I don't know. I was trying to think of a way to explain what you're talking about why it's weird and why, like, knowing who's coming next is a little strange. Did you ever see the movie Arrival?
Yeah.
Okay. So the language that the aliens spoke, or they could, see the future and everything because of it. They had to, like, because the way they wrote circular, you had to know where you were starting and how you were finishing at the same time and meet in the middle. And I kind of feel like it was like, that's my analogy for it. It's like you had to have like both ideas in your head simultaneously. And that would be a pretty weird way to approach story and language, but still the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of sort of I tried to work in sort of a lot of the uniqueness of the situation sort of into the book in some, sort of subtextual ways. Like the idea, the book opens or the beginning of the run that's just me, issue 11 opens with saying like, this is the last X-Men story. And it's Cyclops presenting the idea that he thinks the X-Men are going to end and they're going to go down fighting and all these things. And then halfway through the run, you realize that his narration is not actually necessarily his narration, that like he's being manipulated by Emma Frost. And the things that we're telling you aren't necessarily true because there are other factors at play behind the scenes.
Right.
And like that to me was always sort of my funny joke of it, that it was like, well, we're telling you that this is the end, but like, there's always another level to the end, and there's always another hand at play in these universes, and there's always, someone behind you who's going to continue the story. And for Scott, it's about the sort of immediacy of the moment and the feeling. But for Emma, it's like, well, no, it's a bigger picture than that, and it's not the last X-Men story, and she's doing what she can to make it not. But at the same time, like I think. When you talked about I'm not a wrestling guy, but the kayfabe idea is such an interesting one in comics because, like, we do kill characters a lot. We do break things and destroy things. And intellectually, the audience knows they're going to be fixed. Like, these are billion-dollar characters and franchises. Like, we're not destroying the X-Men. We're not killing, whoever it may be. Like, we're not killing Thor. We're not killing Captain America at any point. Like, they'll disappear, they'll come back. But, I think the point is that if you tell a story that's emotionally honest, where it matters to the characters that these people are dying in their story, the readers want to play along. They want that suspension of disbelief. And so the fact that, like, intellectually people know that Havoc will be back and, all these people will return in a few weeks in Jonathan's X-Men books, like, it didn't matter because they're so invested in the idea of what a comic is and in the universe. And they exist in the universe in the same way the characters exist in the universe. They exist knowing that they died and caring.
Right.
And it's I see the fans who say like, oh well, they'll be back, and it's like, well, yeah, of course they'll be back. Like no one is denying they'll be back. But it's such a weird cynical take for me when people say that instinctively, like before they've read stories where they're like, oh, this is going to be some comic where someone dies, and they're like, they'll be back, and I'm like, yeah, well, of course they'll be back. Like that's not the point. The point is that you're in the moment and have your suspension of disbelief and care. But if you don't care going in, it's not going to work. Like, unless we can make you care, which obviously is part of the job. But it is an interesting hurdle. It's something I see a lot in movies lately. I feel like as audiences get more sort of cynical and things, like you'll go to a movie, like you'll go to the new Star Wars or whatever, and people like are eager to laugh at very earnest moments,
right,
that feel work. And it's like, well, you're not investing in this emotionally in the way you should be. Like you're not going to find it rewarding. And I think there's a sort of interesting turn where I think audiences now go in like looking to be disappointed, and you have to impress them out of it. When I think there was a time when audiences would go to something hoping that it would, like it's a real glass half full, glass half empty kind of situation. But I think if audiences go in cynically to a movie or a book or anything, like they're going to have a lot harder time, and we all have a lot harder time. But you should have to earn it sometimes. You should have to earn the audience's trust. So,
well, and it's kind of it's interesting because you have to put characters in peril, because that's where a lot of the drama comes from. I mean, not saying you have to always put them in peril. There can be all kinds of stories, but to a certain degree, you have to, if you don't have peril in superhero stories, there's no drama. And it kind of reminds me to a certain degree of Avengers Arena, which was a comic that generated a lot of people being very upset. But ultimately, I mean, looking back on it, I mean, I don't know if all of the characters are I'm doing air quotes, back alive. But that was a really good book that did really interesting things with those characters and put them in a very challenging and unexpected situation. I mean, I honestly think to a certain degree, what you had to deal with there, like that setup, and also like what Avengers Arena was doing. But another book that, relates to something you did, I did like an oral history piece of the original Annihilation series that, Andy Schmidt and Keith Giffen and everyone else put together. And the interesting thing, talking to all of the people who worked on that, is because Cosmic Marvel was in such a state of disrepair, like they didn't have to put the toys back in the toy box in the same way, because no one cared about Star-Lord and no one cared about Nova. These were like D-list characters at best, and they got to do whatever they wanted with it. And that, in a different way than what you did on Uncanny, but I think sometimes those weird situations can be kind of freeing in a weird way.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I have Annihilation is a funny one because I worked on the sequel to Annihilation, right, or the sequel to Annihilation, and they said to me like, well, we want it to feel, Darren Shan, who's my editor and great editor, he's like, I want to capture that feeling of the original. And I said, well, the original all tie-ins and events and all tie-ins and minis and one-shots put together is around 80 issues. And I was like, we have 6. And I was like, and they obliterated people. Like they just killed people and messed people up. And like the stakes felt very real because you're like, oh, there hasn't been a Quasar book before in years. I don't know if there's going to be a Quasar book after. Like they could really shelve Quasar for a decade. They could shelve Star-Lord for a decade. They
killed Thanos.
They killed Thanos, yeah. And yeah, the stakes felt very real because of how unimportant the characters were.
Right.
To Marvel at the time, which is an amazing thought because it's like, well, that's what birthed the Guardians of the Galaxy. So it's like, or the modern Guardians. Mm-hmm. So it's a funny thing to try and replicate, but that is definitely a guiding thing for me in, the original Annihilation is a book I love so much, but in Uncanny, it was definitely something I looked towards, but also like, when I was a kid, and obviously a lot of this is seen through a lens of like compression and getting older and taking all your favorite months and putting them together, but I was a big Claremont guy as a kid. I mean, I still am, but the thing for me about the X-Men and why the X-Men was always the book that really grabbed at me the most in some ways is because like the other books were, the Avengers and, the Defenders and all these other teams, Fantastic Four, they were trying to save the universe and save the world and all these things. And the X-Men were doing that stuff, but they were really fighting to survive. And because of that, there was like a real sense that they might not.
Hmm.
And often, a lot of them didn't. But like, when you read, all of Claremont's run, like X-Men drop a lot and they get killed and they get depowered and they go missing and they're tortured. And it's really, really intense. And that sense of like reading a book and then turning the last page and just like feeling like you had to hold your breath for 30 days to find out if like Nightcrawler was going to live or like, whoever was going to make it. That was definitely something I wanted to sort of call back to in a way. But the problem is that like I grew up on those books, but so did all the other readers. And so the same sort of tricks and ideas won't work. Like
Right.
I could just be like, they're in peril because that sense of peril 30 years later doesn't feel the same.
Hmm.
And so like I very early was like, we're going to start killing them. So you actually feel like the peril is very real and very different than what you expect. And I think the sheer scope of what we were trying to do on Uncanny meant that, people did have really strong reactions and people did. I mean, people were really shocked by the book consistently. And that's, a testament, I think, to how much people care about the characters more as much as anything, that you can still do things with them and bend them and break the rules. And I think the same way, like what Jonathan is doing with the X-Men now, it's like, well, they're the same characters, but he's changed them and evolved them and twisted them, and people are shocked and fascinated by them. I think it's a testament to, to what these characters mean and how sort of malleable they are still 30, 40, 50 years after they were conceived,
Yeah. Well, I mean, this next question, I mean, more in like a broader, not necessarily just the X-Men sense, but I do think it's really interesting when you are telling those types of stories. Like, I feel like Annihilation might have been like responded to in a different way if it was released today. Like the original Annihilation, even if you ignore the fact that they were like pure island of misfit toys characters at that point. Because the distance between creator and fan is so much shorter, and I think it's really interesting when you're writing something when you know it's setting something up, and I don't mean like a House of X and Powers of 10 way. I mean even just something within your own story, like you're setting up something for you're on issue 1 and you're setting up something for issue 4. But readers can't know that. They don't know that that's coming. And it seems like a lot of times what happens is people jump to conclusions based off of what happens in this issue without, knowing that there's more to come. Is that a tough part of the job, or is that just something that, you just chalk up as to coming with the territory?
I mean, it's definitely weird, because a lot of ways, we write for the most part long form stories now. We write, I don't want to say we write for the trade because that's a disingenuous term, but you write story arcs. You write 5-issue, 6-issue, 10-issue stories. And I think there's a segment of the population that picks up, of the comic reading population that picks up a book and definitely wants to know everything they need to know in the 20 pages they just bought.
Right.
And that's just not how the medium mostly works anymore. And so you do run into this odd thing of like, I talk about it a lot with other writers where like, when you put out a first issue or a second issue, like you get bombarded with questions of like, what is this? Why did this happen? This isn't how this works. And there's a constant like, you constantly have to deny the impulse to be like, when you sit down to watch, a movie, do you yell that at the screen every 10 minutes? Like, what is this? This isn't how this works. Like, you have to go along with us. Like, there's a story and you don't know what it is and you don't know where it's going. And I understand the audience is paying $4 and sort of wants to get a full meal for that $4, but also I think they don't in some ways, that they don't realize that, like, satisfying one shots are great and I love them, but there's no impetus for you to come back the next week.
Right.
And it is our job to sort of leave you with questions, that leave you with cliffhangers and all these things. And there's certain, I mean, and maybe these people have always existed, and just the presence of social media has made it more prevalent and made their voices louder and sort of easier to see and notice. But yeah, it is a weird thing to me because I feel like I'm constantly trying to explain how a story works. And
Right.
I'm like, in the beginning of a story, like you don't know what this is. And like, it's always, and I think I don't think it's not frustrating or anything. It's just interesting because you encounter people whose brains don't work the same way your brain works, or don't think about things the same way you think about things. And that's sort of what's fun about comics, is that so many people from all walks of life and different, different, totally different types of disparate types of people read them. And so you get all these different sort of takes and why these things matter and why they care about them. But I find it fascinating that people's, like, I'm a person who doesn't watch movie trailers because I don't want to see anything from the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a job where when I put out the first part of a 6-part story, people are just like, who's the bad guy? Why are they doing this? How do they stop them? Like, every time. And I'm like, why do you want me to answer that on Twitter? Like, why would that be enjoyable for you? It's just so alien to me.
I remember one of the thing that stands out the most for this involving your career is when Multiple Man was announced. And in my head, I had the same question that a lot of people ask you on Twitter, which is, where's Layla Miller? And at the same time, I also just thought that in my head, I believe. And I was like, I'm guessing I'm going to find out in the comic if it comes up at all. And it's just really fascinating. I will say, I do think you handle it pretty well. I mean, like, it has to be tough because you probably just want to be like, read the story. But I always feel like you kind of handle it well, and good job by you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, the Layla Miller one was funny because so many people were asking, where's Layla? Where's Layla? Because Jamie settled down with her, but then he died.
Right.
And so I was like, I want her to appear. I don't want people to be waiting for her and expecting her. I want it to feel like a surprise. And so that one I just lied about. So that one I just she's not in the book. She's happy. And I've done that in other books too, where I'm like, I could answer this and it will literally make your enjoyment of the book less. Like,
Right.
it definitely will. And so I'll just lie if I have to. But yeah, the Layla Miller one was super interesting just because it's like, we'll get there. But it's happened in every book I've ever written. In New Mutants, people were just like, how, and some of it goes back to what I was talking about, of like people not going in sort of distrusting the creators and distrusting, looking to be disappointed and upset. In New Mutants, the big one for me was that, like, people were like, Strong Guy and Wolfsbane are on a team together and he killed her son. And like, this is sloppy. You should know that. And it took all my strength not to be like, look at the first issue. He talks to her and she never responds.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's ignoring him. She does not want to be on a team with him. And it's like unspoken for multiple issues. And then it comes out and she says something about it. And then we deal with it. And then we explain all this stuff. But it's like, none of that would have been in a good first issue. None of that is like, I didn't want to just like be like, hey, here's an old story. And we're putting these people who are now have an adversarial relationship on a team. So what I'm going to do right away is throw out that old story and like wipe the slate of it. I was like, I want to work with this. I want to play with it. Like, this is continuity. This is history. This is good. Like, this is good material. And this is something that, like, I can have these characters work through and come together on and find out that he's as haunted by what he did to her as she is. And I think fans really enjoyed it in the end, but watching how upset they were in the beginning was like, that one took a lot of restraint to not just be like, we're going to deal with it. Like, just be patient.
Yeah.
But the assumption that we screwed up and didn't know what happened. And I was like, yeah, I know what happens to these characters. Like, they're my favorite characters. I'm very well aware. So it's always funny. And I see it in everyone's books where people are like, oh, you didn't know that this happened. And it's like, no, the writer knows what happened. Like, people are not whole, wholeheartedly just ignoring or missing things. That doesn't happen in comics. Like there's a whole company built to make sure we don't do that.
Yeah.
So
I'm never fond of using continuity as like a checklist. It's like you have to make sure that you like speak to every single point immediately because like you use that stuff. I always compare it to life. It's like when you're having a conversation with somebody, like they don't always reference every single point that is relevant for that situation in that specific situation because that would not be how life works. And I don't know, good story doesn't work that way either. And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Yo, everybody. As a listener to Off Panel, I'm guessing you love to hear how your favorite stories come together. And on Netflix's Behind the Scenes podcast, that's what you get, an exclusive look at how its biggest series are made. The podcast is back with a new season, giving us an exclusive look at The Witcher. As you might know, The Witcher is a new Netflix original series starring Henry Cavill that's based on Andrew Sapkowski's best-selling books. If I'm being honest with you, they pretty much had me at Henry Cavill, but any show mixing A Tale of Destiny with mutant monster hunters has me fully on board. The Behind the Scenes podcast will tell listeners how they turned nearly 3,000 pages of original material into this Netflix series. Host Brandon Jenkins talks with everyone from executive producers and writers to the cast and even swordmasters who worked on the show. And if you're excited for The Witcher, this podcast is your ticket to an even better experience. The Witcher's season of Behind the Scenes premieres in mid-January with new episodes weekly. Subscribe now by searching for Behind the Scenes The Witcher in your preferred app. And now, back to the show. Let's jump into Hawkeye Freefall. I want to get all the details on all of the heroes and villains and everything that happens in this comic so we can spoil it for everyone. Yeah. But I'm going to start with reading the solicit for the first issue, which arrives 2 days after this is going to drop on January 1st, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the solicit is, when a mysterious and ruthless new Ronin starts tearing a destructive path through the city, suspicion immediately falls on Hawkeye, but Clint has more to worry about than who's wearing his old costume. After a clash with the Hood ends badly, Hawkeye gives himself a new mission that will place him in the crosshairs of one of New York's most dangerous villains. Hawkeye's mission and Ronin's secret plans will set them on a collision course that only one of them will walk away from. First off, I do want to say you actually do identify the villains within, or I'm not you, but I mean, whoever wrote the solicit identified the villains in the very first solicit. So I do like that. You do actually go straight into who's going to be participating. But, this is, Hawkeye books are always really interesting because two things. One, you're invariably going to be compared to Fraction and Aha. I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, especially, I mean, obviously after that, but, and then the second thing is there's, I did think it was really funny that one part in the solicit that I didn't mention is it described Clint Barton as a fan favorite. And I will say, I love, like, there's two types of superhero characters I love: speedsters and like arrow guys, archers. I'm a big fan of both those in Marvel and DC, and I don't know why. It's just a thing.
I wasn't aware that DC had an arrow guy.
That's Green cool. Arrow, come on, man.
I'm not familiar with the character.
Oh. But anyways, so I wouldn't describe Clint Barton as a fan favorite personally. I would say that he is a dude who's around largely. What is the origin of this project? Like, how did it all come together?
Yeah. What's funny about this is that I think that solicit is very good. I don't actually know who wrote it. I didn't. I wrote some of them. And a lot of them I make fun of Clint, and Marvel takes it out. Oh. Like, don't make fun of him. But I believe in the solicit for the second issue, it was taken out, but I think I referred to him as the 16th most popular Avenger. and like, yeah, so fan favorite is a funny choice. I think it sounds nicer than cult favorite.
Sure.
Because he is a cult favorite. He is a real, like, people are super passionate about Hawkeye, and I get it because I am one of those people who's super passionate about Hawkeye. But no, he's not an A-lister. He's not a Captain America, an Iron Man, a Captain Marvel, Black Panther, like any of those people. He's not, the top of the sales chart and someone who always has to have a book. So he is an interesting position because we don't have 100,000 people who are going to buy any Hawkeye book, but we have 20,000 people who really are excited about it. At any given time, at any point in sort of publishing history, I think there's, a small but very passionate Hawkeye fan base, which is really great. And I count myself among them. So I don't say that in unappreciative way. But yeah, the origin of the book is sort of a funny one because I did 2 years ago, I did a book called Tales of Suspense, which was a Hawkeye and Bucky team up book.
Hmm.
It's sort of the fallout of Secret Empire. Sort of Black Widow died in Secret Empire, and someone has come back and is sort of operating, and sort of it looks like her to outsiders, but it's unclear who it is. And Bucky thinks it's someone imitating her, and Hawkeye thinks it's her, and they sort of team up to figure out who it is and what's going on. And I just had such a fun time writing Hawkeye. He's been one of my favorite characters since I was a kid, and Avengers Spotlight was one of my favorite books, and that's basically a stealth Hawkeye book.
Totally a stealth Hawkeye book.
And I loved writing it, and I think people at Marvel really dug my sort of voice for him and my take. And while we were in that book, that was just a 5-issue mini. They said to me, like, well, would you want to do Hawkeye? And I said, yeah, like that's a dream book for me. To me, it's a super prestigious title. I mean, I love the runs that have come before, but like you said, like since Fraction and Aha, you have Jeff Lemire and Kelly Thompson and all these people doing these amazing takes on the character and really being clever and smart in a way that I think is very cool. I think the book really pushes writers and artists to really market as their own in a fun way. So I was very excited to do it, but then I got Uncanny X-Men and Punisher got extended, and I said to Marvel, I said, look, I really want to do this Hawkeye book, but I really want to make sure I have the time and the energy to sort of focus on it, and can we put it on the back burner for a little bit? And Marvel's very cool and allowed that to happen. So as I wrapped those things, I sort of dove into Hawkeye, and that's really the origin of the book. Was like, it's basically a continuation of my Tales of Suspense story. There's just a weird 2-year gap where he joins the West Coast Avengers and does a bunch of other fun stuff. But yeah, it is a book that, like, I'd always loved Hawkeye and always been a huge fan. I made a bunch of jokes about him being the best Avenger online, but he actually is, I think, my favorite Avenger in a lot of ways. I think he's just such a great character to play with, and I have such a blast writing him that he wasn't necessarily my first choice on go-to characters when I started the company, but it's definitely like once I wrote him, I couldn't stop and was like, I have to do more Hawkeye, and that's why he shows up in my Punisher run a bunch and places, just because I'm really kind of obsessed with Hawkeye.
It's funny. I was reading a little bit about, in some of your other interviews you've done involving this book, and I think it's, near as I can tell, it's kind of a why is this dude who's trying to shoot arrows at like giant monsters type of book, where, in a weird way, it's not a great movie, but one of like the best explanations of Hawkeye as an Avenger is in Avengers Age of Ultron, when he's like trying to give a pep talk to Scarlet Witch, and he's like, we're on a island that's floating in the sky and we're fighting giant robots and I have a bow and arrow, and like none of this makes sense. He is like a kind of a character that doesn't make sense in the context of the world that he lives in. So I guess, like, what makes for an interesting, I mean, especially in the prism of like Fraction, Aha, and then also you mentioned, Kelly Thompson and Lee Romero's stuff was great. Jeff Lemire and Ramon Perez, awesome stuff. I mean, the interesting thing about those 3 books is you look at Fraction and Aha, and then Lemire and Perez come on, and like their book's a little bit more action heavy. And you look at Kelly and Leo, and what they did was, it was a pure Kate book, basically. It was a detective book. It was like Veronica Mars with Hawkeye. And that makes for very interesting stories. But it seems like in like almost the post Fraction Aha era, it's like you have to do something very different, otherwise you're just going to be compared. So like, what makes an interesting Hawkeye story to you, I guess?
Yeah, it is funny because I think, I'm sorry if I'm repeating things that you read in other interviews, but I think the interesting challenge of what Fraction and Aha, the gauntlet they laid down, is the fact that like they did something so far off the beaten path in terms of what a Marvel book is and could be, and did it so well that there's a sort of temptation to do the cover band version of it.
Sure.
but that would be so disappointing for everyone involved and everyone who bought it. No one's going to do it as good as Matt and David did. And at the same time, like, if you love what they did, you have to respect the idea that what they did was completely break the mold and change what the book is. And I think what Jeff and Kelly and Ramon and Leo and everyone who came on and did their runs after showed us is that, like, you just have to reset it every time. You have to do something wildly different every time. And so that was sort of my starting point. Is like, I can't tonally feel like anyone else's Hawkeye book. I can't look like anyone else's. Like, me and Otto Schmidt have to be doing something that feels uniquely ours. Um, I wanted, to me, I think, that innovation of what the book can be and how it works is a big part of what the book is. Like, that's the DNA, is that it's always changing. So, for me, I think one of the big things from Go was like figuring out the parts that were fundamental to what a Hawkeye book needs to be and sort of throwing out the rest and then rebuilding it from scratch with, like, keeping everyone else's Hawkeye runs peripherally in my, line of sight. But to me, I think fundamentally, yes, the key to me is like you said, that the Avengers Age of Ultron line is like really speaks well to the core of the character, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Hawkeye for me is the single best entry point into the Marvel universe. Um, he's not a god. He wasn't born with some special abilities. He's not a super genius. Like, he didn't get bit by anything radioactive. He's just a guy,
Right.
who's pretty good at a thing. Uh, but what I think is sort of most fascinating about him is, like, he was a villain.
Yeah.
But he's not a mustache twirling, super evil, wanted to take over the world villain. He was just a kid with a rough upbringing who had bad influences in his life and sort of no one looking out for him. And he looked out for himself. And Captain America comes along and says, "You could be better than this." And now he's a guy who is spending his life atoning for those mistakes and trying to be the thing that Captain America showed him, trying to be that inspiration to other people and that beacon of hope. And so I think he's sort of this fascinating character because he's so human and so relatable and so valuable. I mean, he's really stubborn and he's sort of pig-headed about stuff, and he rushes into things without thinking, and then sort of has to fight his way out, and he's very independent in a lot of ways, and he wants really hard. He wants more than anything to be that force of good in the world that doesn't come easily or naturally to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all of those things are, I think what make a Hawkeye book work is finding those moments and those sort of character beats. And with that, our decision early on was to plant one foot firmly in the camp of Hawkeye's personal life and Hawkeye as an average guy, and one foot firmly in the superhero fighting demons and people out of his element. And just where those worlds intersect and how they don't click well, and how he's constantly at odds in ways that other people aren't, because he has one foot in each world.
Mm-hmm.
So that was sort of my pitch and my take, is like how to make it feel like a Marvel Universe book and make it feel firmly a Marvel book, but also not throw out the amazing personal life stuff, the amazing stuff that is so important to the character of who Clint is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the struggle, and I think if you pick up the first issue, I think you see, we're telling a story where these two worlds are going to come crashing together pretty hard, and the line between friends and allies and enemies and all these things start to blur for him, because he is so driven and determined to be something that isn't naturally who Clint Barton is. And so I think in the end we end up telling a story that's a little different than a lot of what the other Hawkeye books have told, in some ways, I mean, it's very fun and funny and action packed, but it's also like a pretty intense examination of Clint, I think, and um, I'm pretty excited about it because it is something that I think the character really deserves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think, and this is something I actually talked to Chip Zdarsky about last time he was on, because the last time I had him on was before he started his Daredevil run. And I feel like of all Marvel books, maybe like the toughest one to jump onto is Daredevil, because it's like it's like in Mario Kart when you're ghost racing and you're like you're racing your ghost, but there's so many incredible books that you're going up against. Like you're pairing yourself up against Frank Miller and Bendis and Ann Nocenti and Brubaker and Mark Waid and all the artists that worked on it, and it's just like trying to find untapped angles that still fit the character at its core while building off that stuff and all these different things. I always find that to be such a fascinating like thing to watch, to see how people come up with this stuff, because it's like what you were saying earlier. It's like you can't break these toys, but you also have to do enough to set yourself apart. And I feel like there's like a keyhole to fit through there. And I don't know. I mean, that has to be a challenge to try to find those angles and like to find something different to do with these characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it's definitely true. Chip's doing such an awesome job on Daredevil, of telling a story that feels like a Daredevil story, but doesn't feel like a Daredevil story you've seen before. I love it so much. But I think in a lot of ways, yeah, there is this. Frank Miller's never not going to be in your rearview mirror when you write Daredevil. Like, and rearview mirror is an optimistic way to put it. He's never not going to be 100 miles ahead of you when you write. But yeah, I mean, Hawkeye's sort of an easier road. I mean, there's amazing Hawkeye stories and amazing Hawkeye runs, and I don't want to diminish them. But I feel like the legacy of Hawkeye now, especially, is much more. I don't know. It's sort of hard to parse. I mean, Hawkeye obviously is not a constant in the Marvel universe like Daredevil is, and it's not
right.
The book that Frank Miller and Joe Quesada and all these people like really made their names on. But Hawkeye is still, I think, in some ways that same type of book. And yeah, I mean, I every interview I've done for the book, I've mentioned Matt and David's run, partially because I love it, but partially because it's disingenuous not to. I mean,
sure.
It's the thing people think of when they talk about Hawkeye. And you want to do something that both honors it but does feel different, which is a weird feeling to have. But yeah, it's really a challenge, but it's a great challenge. I mean, it's sort of the challenge that every writer wants, of like, go up against these sort of legendary books and creators and runs and see how you measure up and see how, what you can do that people will still be excited about and not just yawn at and leave on the shelf. And so, it's one of the reasons that Hawkeye is so precious to me and so dear to me, because I feel like we really are doing something with a character in the book that we haven't seen done before in a lot of ways, but still feels natural and organic and makes sense. I mean, he's not, we're not turning him into an alien or, doing something crazy. At the end of the day, you want people to say like, yeah, this felt like a Hawkeye book, but it wasn't what I expected it to be.
Right.
And that is, I think, one of the hardest things in writing superhero books. Like, it's, getting up on stage and playing a song everyone's heard before, but doing it in a way that it sounds totally new to them. And that's, yeah, it's one of the most fun challenges for sure in this job, but it is also one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is. It's always really interesting to see what people come up with all this stuff. I will say that you're starting with a very nice point. I mean, I like the fact that you're bringing a Ronin in, but also, I mean, I have to admit, I write down topics for things I want to talk about in this, and one of them was just I wrote down the Hood rules because I love the Hood. Why? So why were those two characters you knew you wanted to work in? Like, were those characters you had? I mean, obviously Ronin makes sense given Hawkeye's history, but I don't think the Hood and Hawkeye have a lot of history in the past. Do they just seem like they naturally would jive together given their street level feel?
The Hood to me is, I think, the Hood is one of the great Marvel villains. I love the Hood so much. I love, Brian Vaughan's Hood book is a near perfect comic, and everything Bendis did with him, I just love, and he's just had some great runs and some great stories. But I think he's a character that suffers from not being anyone's nemesis.
Right.
He's a floating villain, and I like him enough that I was like, you know what? Like, I want to make him Hawkeye's nemesis as much as I can. But not just for the sake of liking the Hood, but I think he's actually kind of a perfect foil for Hawkeye in a lot of ways. I think that their origins are very similar.
Totally.
They're both, like I said, like, they're guys who ended up on the wrong side of the law, not because of anything but bad circumstances and no one looking out for them. And where Hawkeye had Cap come in and save him and sort of correct him, the Hood never had that. And the Hood is not, I mean, he's sort of elevated to be a pretty villainous dude at this point. But at his core, like, he wasn't. He's not. He's just a guy who had a family and was trying to do right and get by. And I think, he's a guy who sort of can't understand how he became a crime boss and a crime lord and how he's all these things. He was a, like, petty criminal who sort of lucked out and is, not respected in the same way that a Doctor Doom or a, Norman Osborn is, in the same way that I think Clint isn't respected in the same way that, a Cap or Tony Stark or Spider-Man is. And I think, I said to someone recently, I said, if the fundamental Daredevil story when we're done with Daredevil is, to me, will always be Matt Murdock and Wilson Fisk are two sides of the same coin, and both of them have sort of crises of faith, and that's sort of the driving story. Clint Barton and Parker Robbins are the same. They're two sides of the same coin, except it's not a crisis of faith. It's a crisis of self-confidence. Like, they are guys who are constantly trying to fight and prove that they deserve to be where they are. And I think it infuriates both of them to see where the other is. That, like, Parker Robbins knows that he could be one of the great heroes if things had been a little different and someone had spoken to him early. He could have been a Hawkeye type figure with the powers he has, but he has a demonic cloak and it's not there for him. And Hawkeye inversely sees the Hood, sees himself in the Hood, and sees, like, the guy who no one saved, and it breaks his heart and it makes him mad and frustrated, and he doesn't know how to handle it. So I think pitting them against each other, once we started working on it, it just made so much sense to me. And I just, I would love it if this stood the test as a long-standing rivalry. Like, that to me is what both of them need. And I think it just makes so much sense for both of them.
I just want to say, I love that. That is amazing. I love all of that because I don't know. I feel like it's interesting. The Hood has a very fascinating story behind him because, you look at the very first story. Like, I love the original Hood's miniseries that BKV, Brian K. Vaughan, and Kyle Hotz and Eric Powell did together. And then he was like kind of, he started his own Illuminati and he became this, like, crime boss. And, like, he's really run the spectrum. And it kind of feels like there's, like, a malleability to him that hasn't allowed him to find, like, in the same way that you're talking about Hawkeye doesn't have his arch nemesis or his, like, opposing number. It feels like the Hood hasn't been defined because he's just kind of always been thrown into these other situations to see if he works, and he's never found that one that works with him. And so, I mean, what you're describing, like, them as the mirror image or the other side of the coin, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think the Hood suffers from the fact that he was defined by himself. He wasn't defined by a hero.
Right.
He's defined in the Hood, like in the book The Hood. So like there was never he was so well fleshed out that it didn't make sense for him to be like, and you know what, like Luke Cage hates him. Like so now I'm doing that. The thing I just said doesn't make sense. I'm like, well, Clint Barton hates him. But I think also, yeah, they're great. They're great opposite numbers for each other, but they are also, yeah, like they suffer from the same problem. Like Hawkeye's been the head of the Avengers and the leader of the Thunderbolts and all these things, but at the end of the day, he's not. When you're like, oh, who's the leader of the Avengers? People say Captain America, and then you're like, well, not Cap, and then they'll be like, well, Iron Man, and they'll list 30 Avengers before they get to Clint. And the Hood is the same way, that it's like, well, he was the crime boss of New York, he was the head of the Illuminati, but people just think of him as like that guy who screws stuff up a lot, and
Right.
that's like great. The other thing that I love about pitting them against each other is like I think they fit really well together.
Sure.
Except unlike a Kingpin and Daredevil, where it's like, well, Kingpin and Daredevil are like in a fist fight are equally matched. The Hood is a much heavier weight than Hawkeye. Like the Hood is a demonically magically powered supervillain who really Hawkeye is just a guy with bow and arrow. And I love the idea that Hawkeye's opposite number is the kind of guy where everyone goes, oh no, he's going to kill you. Like this is not going to be a long protracted fight on a rooftop where like, oh, who's going to win? Everyone's just like, the Hood's going to murder you, dude. You need to stop. Like you need to let Doctor Strange deal with him. Like you need to let someone else take him out.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a running gag in the book, is that Hawkeye is kind of like messing with the Hood, and the people who are very close to him are like, this is a dangerous person, be careful. And the people who aren't that close to him are like, really, dude? Like the Hood? Like you didn't get superpowers somehow, did you? You're just a guy with bow and arrow, right? And so it's funny, but it also speaks to the sort of I think it's a very Hawkeye thing that he'd be like, I'm picking a nemesis, and it's a guy who could kill me at any minute.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really like them. As for the Ronin element, you know, it's funny you asked the question like, well, Ronin, why did you use this character? And Ronin's not a character per se.
Right. It's an identity.
It's an identity, and it's been four people's identities. Obviously, the first one being Clint, but I can't talk a ton about it.
Sure.
But I will say, like, as it unfolds, there's a certain idea that like Clint is making bad decisions in this book, and someone out there is following his previous bad decisions and running with them, and he is seeing that firsthand, seeing like a new Ronin who he doesn't know sort of wage war in the city, and he's attacking federal agents and fighting superheroes and robbing people, and Clint is just like, can't see, like everyone around him can see, like, this is you, this is what you're doing, this is the path you're on again.
Mm-hmm.
And to Clint, it's totally foreign and alien, and he just looks at the Hood and looks at Ronin and is just like, how did this come to be? And he can't comprehend his role in this sort of in the Ronin problem he's dealing with. And I think that's a fundamentally a big thing of Clint, is like, he's not a big picture guy in a lot of ways. He's a brilliant fighter, and he's passionate, and he's always, you know, he's super loyal and dedicated, and he's always going to be the first to run into battle, but he's never the one who like is going to see the whole battlefield. That's not how he works. He's, you know, for lack of a better term, he's got sort of tunnel vision to a target, and that's all he cares about. And so the Ronin being a problem as it swirls around him in this part of his past that he like never tidied up in the way he should have, is a big thing for the story, and how he chooses to deal with things going forwards, and how he makes the wrong choices a lot. So
yeah. Well, just a few more questions. I did want to ask about Otto Schmidt, and what he brings to the book. I do think it's, I mean, I'm not going to say the name of the other book he worked on. He does have superhero archer experience, which seems useful. But what makes him a good complement for you on this book? Because it seems like, I mean, the preview pages look great.
Yeah. I mean, Otto is a genius. I'm not one of those people who throws that around lightly, and it's like, oh, that person's, coffee making genius or whatever. uh, I'm sure there are. I don't drink coffee, so I don't really know what a coffee making genius would be. I'm sure they exist, but Otto is he's not a good compliment to me on the book. I'm definitely trying to compliment him and keep up with him.
Sure.
It is an art show, 100%. Yeah, he's just one of those rare artists who's the fully the complete package. His stuff is unique and it's beautiful, and like you can hand it to a fan of indie comics and they'll love it and just fall in love with it. But I think it's not that much of a departure from superhero, like the meat and potato superhero people, that they can look at it. But I think at the end of the day, like the funny thing about starting a book with a new artist is always, there's this sort of awkward first date of like finding out what the other person's into and what they're good at, and you want to talk about the things that they're interested in, and you want to say interesting things, and so you spend a lot of time being like, what is Otto good at? Like what can I give him that he'll like to draw? What can I give him where he'll excel? Like where can we have these good moments together? And I realized really quickly, he worked on Green Arrow with Ben Percy, and I grabbed Ben when I was starting on the book, and I was like, hey Ben, like what should I know about Otto? And he was like, just get the hell out of his way. And I was like, yeah, that's sort of what I thought. And it's true. Like Otto, he draws amazing action and amazing fight scenes that are like energetic and cool, but also like kind of brutal and intense. But also like he does just great atmosphere and great character acting and like expressions, and he can nail a joke like so few artists. Like he's taking whole, like I'm pretty detailed in the way I write a page. I lay out shots and angles and where everyone's hands are and stuff like that. I'm annoying, but I always tell my artists, like, this is just how I see it in my head. Once you have the script, it's entirely yours. Do how you see it. If you're feeling lazy, like, this is a good Cliff's Notes on how you could do it. But if none of this makes sense to you, or you got a better way, like, go for it. And Otto, I get the pages back from him, and I have to sit there because he's adding panels and he's changing things. And I sit there and I know that he's made them better. And sometimes it's just the key of like, why is this panel here? And then I'll be like, oh, he recognized that this line that I had as a throwaway line in a balloon is really a good joke, and he wants that to be its own panel in a reaction shot. And like, he's seeing stuff in the script that like I'm not even noticing. Like, he's noticing things that could really shine and excel. And it's the dream collaboration for me of just having an artist who just takes your stuff and just makes it so much better. I honestly, I've said it as a joke, but like, honestly, if you find me insufferable or like hate my writing, it's still probably a pretty good $4 spent to look at the book just for Otto's art. You can white out my balloons and have a really good comic at the end of the day. Still,
I gotta say, I just decided to do a Google image search while we were chatting, just like looking at Otto's art, and it is honestly astonishing seeing how many styles he takes on. Like, this is like a Stuart Immonen level of like style changes. The stuff that he does, it goes from like almost like like a Bruce Timm animation style to like some really, really deep indie stuff to like Cheesecake, and like the spectrum is kind of unbelievable. Like I've mostly read his stuff in like Green Arrow and other comics, and I've never seen the stuff he does outside of it. And just looking at that, I was kind of staggered by it. That guy is much more versatile than I realized.
Yeah, in this book, like, I say to people, like, they're like, oh, what's the feel of the book? And I say, like, it's kind of got a Bruce Timm vibe. It's got a Darwin Cook vibe. It's got some Toth influence, but it's got a lot of different styles of people going on. But like, yeah, the dude can do anything. He's such a monster. And like, he found just the right, he turned in sketches for Hawkeye early on, and I was just like, and there were a few that were different. And I was like, the first one, like the first one you drew is the one we have to go with. And he was like, yeah. And he just was drawing other characters to just be like, oh, this is Gamora. And I was like, oh man, can we get Gamora in the book? And then I was like, no, we definitely can't fit Gamora in this book. But like, he was just like sending me doodles and stuff, and they were so good. But yeah, he's so versatile and amazing. And it's one of those things like when the first pages were coming in, there was a Marvel Creative Summit, and there's 14 or 15 of the writers in the room, and we were talking about art and the project, and they put up some of Otto's pages on the screen. And it's one of those things where all the writers and editors are like, they're taking notes on things, they're getting ready to talk about stuff, they're jotting things down, they're having little private conversations about stuff. And when Otto's pages went up, everyone sort of went quiet, and I looked up and I just saw like Mark Waid and Nick Spencer and Scotty Young and Donnie Cates and all these people, Kelly Thompson, just sort of like leaning in to look at the screen, and I just like wanted to jump up and be like, stay away from him, like he's mine, we're doing Hawkeye, like just back off, because it was like a real moment of like everyone knew his stuff. He'd been doing stuff at DC and been around and stuff, but like when you see the pages for this book, like people were just really like kind of blown away, and it's an awesome feeling. I'm really excited for people to finally see it. It's like, if nothing else, I'm really proud to be bringing Otto to a large audience that hasn't seen his stuff before, because he's so talented.
Yeah. Well, last question I want to ask was, it has nothing to do with Hawkeye, or it kind of does, I guess. I was looking through what you've done at Marvel, and you had a 26-ish issue run on the Punisher when you combine the two books, I think, and then you had Uncanny, which was 25 issues with 10 of them. What's that?
Yeah, 25 if you count the 3-issue War of the Realms.
Kelly and Ed. Yeah, I mean, but it to a certain degree, I mean, I think the Punisher definitely was your baby to a degree, but it seems like a lot of the stuff you do is like kind of shorter, smaller projects. And while a lot of those you probably know ahead of time, I am curious, like, do you find that because you've had like a lot of shorter runs, or like titles that I'm not casting aspersions against Hawkeye again. I love Hawkeye, but at the same time, he has a tendency of having, shorter runs because he's Hawkeye. Do you find that changes your approach at all on like how you're thinking about story, that like it can expand or contract depending on success? Or do you kind of always go in with a short-term thought and a long-term thought in case like it does go bigger? I mean, I guess I'm curious as to like how you shift approach with like some level of uncertainty,
Yeah, I mean, I will say a lot of it is not as uncertain as it seems. Like a lot of times, miniseries are miniseries, and that going in, even if
right.
the audience doesn't. And obviously, if something takes off and is stellarly huge, they'll be like, oh, well, we figured out a way to keep this going. But yeah, I really like a miniseries. I like a lot of the like underloved characters. I like a lot of the people who are not, blazing up the charts, because, in the same way we talked about with the Daredevil, like, I love Captain America. I would love to write Captain America, but like, Mark Grunwald's Captain America will forever be something that hangs over me, like Iron Man, like there just runs on Iron Man that you just are inescapable in their gravity. And I love the characters that don't have the steady 30 or 40 year history of their books.
Like U.S. Agent.
Like U.S. Agent. I love U.S. Agent very much. And that's why I made sure he was in ForceWorks. But yeah, I just think that there's something fun about those types of short stories. And I'm a big fan. There's an interesting thing that sort of developed in fandom, I think, very outside of sort of my sort of point of entry. I don't know how to describe it, but this idea, when I got to Marvel, the idea that miniseries, quote unquote, don't matter,
was
something that I found really fascinating, because to me that's like saying like, well, the Star Wars movies don't matter because they're only 2 hours long. Like, I only care about the Mandalorian because it's a TV show, and it's like, why doesn't a 6-issue or a 5-issue thing matter? Like, it matters, obviously, like, it matters if you care about it. But I understand the core idea that people are like, they're not going to fundamentally change things in a miniseries. They're not going to move the ball down the field that much in a miniseries. And I think when I got to the company, like, people like me and Donnie and Chip and Kelly and Ed and sort of my class at Marvel, we're all big supporters of the miniseries. We're all big fans of that format of, like, tell the story you need to tell and be done with it. Like, don't put in filler. Don't just milk something. Don't keep it going if it doesn't need to keep going. Like, obviously some things should be ongoings, but some things should be miniseries. And I think all of us had the idea of, like, well, let's make miniseries matter. Like, let's make sure that at the end of a miniseries, like, these people are walking off the page on the last page are not in the same position they were when they started. And I think you see it in, like, books like New Mutants, Dead Souls, but you see it a lot in, like, Dead Man Logan is a miniseries, and Ed killed him. Like Silver Surfer Black, like, all these books that people do where they're just like, we're all trying to be like, miniseries matter. Like, these are some of the best stories we're going to be telling at Marvel are miniseries. Like, get excited about them.
I want to throw one out real quick. Meet the Scrolls. I loved Meet the Scrolls.
Oh, The Scrolls is such a good book. Robbie Thompson killed it on that book.
Yeah.
It's one of the best Marvel books of the year, undoubtedly. And yeah, I mean, I just think there's great minis all the time that there's a segment of the audience that just wants the idea of the ongoing thing and not get reinvested. And that's cool. I get it. But some of the best stories are happening in minis. So I'm always sort of gravitating towards them. I really like writing minis in a lot of ways. I love writing X-Men. I love writing Punisher. X-Men is sort of a weird one just because I'm so trained in my X-Men fandom by what people like Claremont and Peter David did, where they were seeding stories for over years with little clues and little hints and setting them up. And so that's something I tried to do without having a 5-year runway on a book. But, like, Phoenix Resurrection leads into Multiple Man, leads into New Mutants, leads into Astonishing X-Men, leads into Uncanny. Like, they're all connected tangentially through little clues. So that's, that's the way the approach changes. I don't know what I would do if they told me New Mutants was going to be, 100 issues.
Right.
It would be a different thing, but, like, the stuff I wanted to do in New Mutants spilled over into Astonishing and Uncanny because of that. Obviously, with, different books, it works differently. With Rocket Raccoon or, Secret Warriors or Kingpin, it's like, well, those were short stories, and we always knew they were going to be short stories. So there wasn't a lot of, like, well, how would my approach change? But I think it's tricky. It's you have to be able to do a sprint and a long distance run if you work at these companies. It is sort of a big thing of being able to change and roll with the punches. And I love that as a challenge. It gets frustrating at times, but at the same time, it's like, with this Hawkeye book, like, I don't actually know how many issues we're doing. I pitched it as a 6-issue series.
Mm-hmm.
And then they said, well, what if it does well? I said, well, this is what the second story would be. This is what the third story would be. But the thing I pitched was 6 issues, and we're definitely doing that. And I'm sure I'll know soon whether or not we're doing more or not. But, the thing that I wanted to do afterwards with Clint, if Hawkeye doesn't continue, I'm going to talk to them about putting that in a different book. And I already know what book that would be. And I'm already, like, in talks with them about doing that book anyway. So, a lot of times it's like building stories out of Legos. Like,
right.
You miss a piece or you need to make it bigger. They all snap together in the end. Like, it's fine.
Well, I like what you were talking about with New Mutants and with Astonishing and all those other books. I mean, you've seen it elsewhere too, where it's like on a much larger scale. You look at what Jonathan Hickman did on like Secret Warriors, and then Fantastic Four and FF, and then Avengers and New Avengers, and leading into Secret Wars. It's like you can see the connection between all of those. Or like what Al Ewing did with like Mighty Avengers and Ultimates, and leading into like Immortal Hulk. Like there's all this connectivity there, but it's not like you plan that. Like, Al didn't plan, okay, in 7 years when I'm writing Immortal Hulk, I'm going to work this in there. These are connections you can build as you're taking on these books. Actually, like I've found that I've become more attracted to miniseries, especially ones where there's like, consistent books with like writers that are in this world, because it allows for both. There's like a flexibility there, but there's also like a consistency that is a little bit more atypical. And I don't know, I just find that to be really appealing. It's weird. It's like when I was younger, I was like, oh yeah, keep these guys on this book forever. And now I'm just like, oh yeah, let's do some different flavors and see how it connects, because it makes it pretty interesting. I don't know. It's weird how that's shifting.
Yeah, I think it is fun. I think, a lot of it has to do with the changing landscape of what comics is, and sustainability of ongoing series and what it means. But I think you're seeing the natural reaction of writers who grew up on these long soap operas be like, well, I don't want to say goodbye to these characters. So they're going to appear, like my Mighty Avengers characters, themes and ideas are going to appear in Ultimates, and they're going to appear in Immortal Hulk. And, yeah, I think it creates these fun threads through the universe that are really cool, and in a way that there didn't used to be those threads before. It used to be like, well, a Chris Claremont X-Men story is going to exist in the X-Men, and it's going to go, and maybe there'll be a crossover, and the Avengers will show up, or they'll go to Asgard or whatever it is, but like it's going to be sort of self-contained. And now it feels like the because we all move around so much, the sort of tendrils of our stories spread out everywhere, and that's definitely a thing that I think is really fun too. I really enjoy seeing sort of, and not just the idea, not just like the characters and ideas, but also like the way different writers handle different things. I mean, I think nothing to me is more fun than seeing, the guy who writes Howard the Duck and just makes it hilarious come in and write Daredevil. That's just so heartbreaking and brutal. And just like, that's fun to me as a fan. Like, I'm a big Stanley Kubrick guy. Like, I love the fact that, the guy who made one of the best science fiction movies, made one of the best anti-war movies, made one of the best, horror films. Like, I love that. I love that sort of versatility. Like, you see it in a lot of the great directors and writers, and it's fun. I wouldn't want to see someone just live in one wheelhouse. A writer I love, I wouldn't want to see them just operate in one place for 10 years so much anymore. I would love to see, like, I sit there and I go, oh man, I love Jason Aaron's, Ghost Rider. I want him to write Ghost Rider for a decade. No, I want to see Jason write Avengers. Like, I want to see Jason write Thor. I loved his Thor for a decade, but like, I'm so excited for what he does next now.
Mm-hmm.
Because I love his work so much that it's awesome to see where it's going to go,
Yeah.
Like Nick Spencer going from Superior Foes of Spider-Man to Secret Empire is like such a brilliant 180 of creativity that it's hard, there are people who may be detractors, but it's like, yeah, it's Secret Empire is about as hard hitting and controversial and, in your face a book as Marvel's going to do. And Superior Foes is about as fun a book as Marvel's going to do. And that's just awesome. So, I try and I'm pretty proud of the fact that I was writing Multiple Man and The Punisher at the same time. Like, I feel like that was a pretty good example of that in my own wheelhouse.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was, and I'm sure Hawkeye will be. I'm looking forward to seeing the combination of Hawkeye, Freefall, and Forceworks. Forceworks, an idea that I definitely never thought I was going to see again, but will be fun to see come back. But Matthew, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Hawkeye, Freefall, writing comics, and all kinds of other things. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was awesome.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Matthew Rosenberg. You can find him on Twitter at @AshcanPress and his work in the upcoming Hawkeye, Freefall, and ForceWorks 2020. As a heads up, Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out the new version of the site and consider subscribing for access to all the site's content and its members-only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow it on Twitter at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Kenny Porter, Chris Pachalo, Torin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Chris Verta, Transmitter Down, Harry Sayer, Walt's Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Litwin Studios, Kill Wilson, Nathan House, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Troy Jeffrey Allen, Leona Kingus, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Connor Farner, Vita Yala, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Kent Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Greg Rucka, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert Nicolo, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.